Will today, Friday the 4th of October, go down in the history of football as the day that changed the sport forever? Football transfers, love them or hate them, such an integral part of the footballing landscape that we've all come to know. But has today's ruling by the European Court of Justice, has that rendered them illegal and soon to be obsolete? Has today's judgment signalled, if not the end of football transfers, then certainly the beginning of the end? And if you don't know what I'm talking about, well, I forgive you, because this has not been widely talked about. Certainly not as widely as you would expect, given the dramatic consequences that could ensue from this decision today. So how did we get here? Now, I did a video on Monday when I first heard about it in The Guardian, talking about it and going over some details. I will attach a link to that. It will pop up now. But just to give you a brief overview, this has all come about because of one player, a former Arsenal player, or at least that's how he was described in the article I read, has challenged FIFA by taking them to court 10 years ago. That's how long this court case has been rumbling on, challenging the way that transfers are done. So let me give you some background. The player in question is Diarra, who spent his formative youth career travelling between about 4 or 5 clubs before he ended up at Le Havre. Spent a year as a professional player for Le Havre before transferring to Chelsea. In his 2 years at Chelsea, he won the League Cup and the FA Cup. The League Cup actually against us in that what became known as the Drogba final, where Walcott put us 1-0 up in 12 minutes. And let's not talk about it. But he started that day as right back in the League Cup and later on won the FA Cup in the same season, although he was an unused substitute in Jose Mourinho's side. Apparently the disappointment of not getting to play any minutes in the FA Cup led to him asking for a transfer. And Arsene Wenger, who perhaps so impressed by his performance in the League Cup final, and certainly regarding him as a multifunctional, to quote Arsene at the time, player, decided to buy him for an undisclosed fee. He only lasted 7 games and 5 months at Arsenal before it became obvious to him that Mathieu Flamini was going to be getting that midfield spot ahead of him, and so he again managed to get a move, this time to Portsmouth. And in his 1 year at Portsmouth, he managed to win the FA Cup. So it's not bad. At this point, he's 23 years old and he's won the League Cup and the FA Cup twice. Now, from Portsmouth, he gets a move to Real Madrid. Bit of a shock move, but probably one justified by his ability. And Real Madrid becomes the club he spends the longest time at. He's there from 2009 to 2012. And in that time, he wins La Liga, the Copa del Rey, and the Supercopa as well. But towards the end of his time there, Jose Mourinho, his Chelsea manager, takes over and signs Sami Khedira. And again, it starts to become apparent to Diarra that he isn't going to get the game time he wants at Real Madrid. Encouraged by apparently Samuel Eto'o, he accepts a transfer to FC Anji Makachakula, which I'm sure I'm saying wrong, but look, they don't exist anymore anyway. So you could do an entire video on the club Makachakula, but we will call them FC Anji from now on. This is a club that was formed in 1991 and at the dissolution of the Soviet Union joins Russian football. And at a certain point, they get really strong investment and they go out and start buying players like Samuel Eto'o, who is apparently responsible for encouraging Diarra to join, as well as Willian, as well as Roberto Carlos. So they're doing that kind of, you'll probably remember, if you're a certain age, you'll remember the investment that was going into Russian football. And things go pretty well, or at least not badly at Anji. But in that year that Diarra is there, they don't call it, there is a decision made by the owner of the club to cut the wage bill by 75%. And so all of the big name players, Samuel Eto'o and Willian, are sold to Chelsea, and Diarra, along with 2 others, is sold to Lokomotiv Moscow. At this point, he becomes Lokomotiv Moscow's second most expensive transfer in history. And things start really well. He's voted Supporters Player of the Month 2 months running. He's playing regularly. He's got his first team slot and the minutes that matter so much to him. But after the winter break and heading in towards summer, he starts to fall out with Leonid Kuchuk, who's the manager at Lokomotiv Moscow, but only manager for a year. It doesn't work for him either. But in the time period that these two are working together, they fall out. Diarra stops turning up for training so much, and it gets to a point where Lokomotiv Moscow make the decision that they're going to terminate his contract. And this is where it starts to get really interesting, because obviously for the rest of us, if your boss decides to sack you, so be it. You take your marching orders, you may get pay, you may get a small amount of severance pay, but you go and find yourself another job. And that is exactly what Lassana Diarra does. He goes out, finds interest from Charleroi, the Belgian club, and they accept that they're happy to sign him. But this is where it gets interesting, and this is where it's relevant to today. Lokomotiv Moscow insist that Diarra owes them the money from the breach of contract. After all, they have just made him their second most expensive transfer, and just less than a year later, the contract is torn up, and somebody's got to reimburse them for that money that they gave FC Angie. Diarra says it's got nothing to do with him. He wasn't involved in the contract, so why should he owe the money? They've cancelled his contract. The loss should be on them. They go to court, and FIFA rules in favour of Lokomotiv Moscow and says that until such time as Diarra has paid the compensation, the international transfer certificate, which is what teams own, they don't after all own the players, but they own those players' right to work within FIFA. If he doesn't pay the compensation, then that transfer certificate will not be handed over. Charleroi pull out of their interest in him, and Diarra takes this case to the Court of Arbitration in Sports, CAS, who also find in favour of Lokomotiv Moscow and say that in the year and a half since he's played for Lokomotiv Moscow at this point, that he's been banned, and he still has to pay the compensation due to Moscow, as well as now 110,000 costs to CAS. Now, for many players, this would just be the end of it. You've been ruled against by FIFA, you've been ruled against by the Court of Arbitration, and you just give up there. But not Lassana Diarra. He still doesn't feel he's had justice. He still feels like he's in the right. So he engages the services of a law firm run by Jean-Louis Dupont. Now, if you're really into football law and the big cases, then maybe you've already heard of Jean-Louis Dupont, because he was pivotal in the Bosman ruling, which, again, if you're into this sort of thing, you will know the Bosman ruling, and people still talk about it. He's gone on a Bosman. It's become part of the language you use in football. But that was a case in 1995 where a Belgian footballer sued the Belgian FA and FIFA because he wasn't allowed to play for a different team because the club at the time would own the rights to the ITC, the same thing that we're talking about here, even after the expiry of a contract. So this whole world of free transfers we now live in, where people like Kylian Mbappe can go for free at the end of their contract despite having cost 150 million to Paris Saint-Germain, is all made possible by Dupont and Mark Bosman winning their case against FIFA. Now, in 2014, having engaged Dupont, it's taken 10 years to get to this place, which is where the European Court of Justice, same court that ruled on the Bosman transfer, have been asked to rule on this. And their conclusion today, well, that's where the seismic nature of this all comes in. After 10 years of reviewing this case, and just to give you some extra context, last year the Advocate General of the European Court of Justice said that he felt that actually this was a likely outcome, that the European Court would probably find in favour of the plaintiff. Essentially, the case that Dupont and Diarra are bringing for review to the European Court of Justice was that FIFA rules apply in cases where a club considers that one of its players has terminated his employment contract without just cause before the normal term of that contract, and in that case the player and any club wishing to employ him are jointly and severally liable for any compensation due to the club, the former club. In addition, the new club may in certain situations be banned from registering any new players for a given period. So, in the judgment that the European Court of Justice gave today, it held that all those rules were contrary to European Union law. It found that they impeded the free movement of professional footballers wishing to develop their activity by going to work for a new club established in the territory of another EU member state. Quoting from the judgment, it says, "Those rules impose considerable legal risks, unforeseeable and potentially very high financial risks, as well as major sporting risks on those players and clubs wishing to employ them, which taken together are such as to impede international transfer of those players, the court stated. It added that although some restrictions on free movement could be justified by overriding public interest reasons, the FIFA rules seemed to go beyond what was necessary to pursue such objectives. The court also found that EU rules could restrict or prevent cross-border competition among EU clubs. The possibility of competing by recruiting trained players plays an essential role in the professional football sector, it stated. Now the case goes back to Belgian court. So just in short, the way to look at this is that the rules of FIFA contravene the laws that govern European employment. Footballers, it now seems, may have recourse to the same laws that protect you and I. After all, you and I can't go into work on Monday and expect that our boss tells us we've been sold to a competitor and we've got to move possibly to a different country. Now, accepting that obviously players do have a right to veto it and maintain a certain contract. But as it stands, players are bought and sold against their will, or at least without any involvement. Diarra's case is very simply put that FC Angie sold him to Lokomotiv without him having any input into that transfer fee. So why should he be eligible for it? And today's law begins a process by which that might be upheld. So what does that do to the transfer system if, although you pay a huge amount of money for a player, if that contract is terminated by you or the player, then you're not due any compensation? The first thing that occurs to me is that you certainly aren't going to spend £100 million on a player who could give you 4 weeks' notice and move. It's unlikely you'd pay £1 million for a player under those circumstances. So how's this decision been received, and what can we expect from here? Well, the World Players Union, FIFPro, sees it as a milestone, saying that the rules were a central part of the FIFA transfer system, and it has long held that the rules treat players as economic assets rather than employees and footballers. And that's true, isn't it? I think we can all accept that. If you step back from football, if you didn't know anything about football or love it as much as we do, you would wonder, how is it possible that you can buy and sell a human being? And it's easy to see how for players it would be far better for their interests if they weren't held to these ridiculous contracts. FIFPro have gone on to say that the European Court of Justice has ruled that a central part of the FIFA transfer system in place since 2001 constitutes a restriction of competition by object and a violation of the free movement of workers. On behalf of professional football players worldwide, FIFPro welcomes these findings. The ECJ has handed down a major ruling on the regulation of labour market in football and more generally in sport, which will change the landscape of professional football. That's how the World Players Union has seen it. Perhaps unsurprisingly, Dupont, Jean-Louis Dupont and Diarra have seen it as a total victory and said it should lead to the modernisation of football's rules on player movement. FIFA, on the other hand, have completely played down the significance. They've said it only put into question 2 paragraphs of 2 articles of the overall regulations governing the status and transfer of players. That generally it's upheld that transfers are fine and are legal. Clubs so far have not made any official comment, but it does make you wonder again, doesn't it? Is this why we've seen a slowing down of the transfer market? Because, yeah, as I said earlier, the Advocate General of the Court of Justice said last year that he thought that this would likely be the outcome of this case. And you would be loath to spend a huge amount of money in a transfer market if you felt that at any time that amount of money could just be worth nothing. So it's clear that we don't fully know yet. This will go back in court. This is yet to be processed. It's still going to take a long time. But ultimately, it could lead to a huge change in the way transfers are handled, the money transacted, and the terms of those contracts. And the reality is that FIFA does not at this point have a plan B. Nobody quite knows what would replace it. Certainly the idea that footballers would be treated just like anybody else seems reasonable on one hand. But when you think of the impact on football, the ecosystem of football, small clubs buying players, developing them and training them so that they can be sold for large amounts of money, which is often invested into the infrastructure of smaller leagues and smaller clubs, that would disappear overnight. That it would literally come down to players would be offered an amount of money by a club, they would go and play for that club, and they would have the right to terminate that contract as and when they felt like. And so Obviously, they'd have to be paid more and more money, which isn't hugely in favour of the bigger clubs. I don't know what the possible ramifications of this are, and I don't think anybody does. It's possible, of course, that FIFA will manage to negotiate in such a way as to keep the main areas of transfers whole, but it seems unlikely they're going to be able to stop players terminating their contracts, and that players will not be held liable for those contract terminations, nor will the clubs they go to. And that, if you like, may not be the end of transfers as we know it, but it might be the crack in the glass of the aquarium. It might be the crack in the dam. That lawyers will now swarm all over this. They will put pressure on that crack until it does open and burst, because at heart, there is a huge amount of money in football. Because at its heart, this concerns money, and there is a huge amount of money in football. And if you suddenly stop to think, what happens to that money if it's now not going between the clubs as transfer fees? It'd be lovely to think, that going to watch football could be made free by the investment in TV companies, but it's not going to be that. The money's going to go somewhere. Could you see a world in which some of these players are making £1 million a day instead of £1 million a month, or whatever current absurd level it is at the moment? Since the Bosman ruling, we've seen year on year more and more of the money in football going to players. I'm not necessarily opposed to that. Perhaps you are. We could have a debate on that. I'm not sure where the money should go. There is an obscene amount of money in football. Would you prefer it all went to the owners of clubs? I don't think so. But this ruling today is key. It is landmark, and it is not being discussed. But I'm going to keep following it. I'm going to keep going on this one, because I don't think anything that I've seen, certainly not the Manchester City trial, nothing I've seen has the potential to have this level of impact. Bigger, in fact, than the Bosman ruling, which changed fundamentally the way football transfers are done. So if you're interested in this kind of thing, and I hope you are, then click subscribe, because I plan to keep talking about this until it reaches its natural conclusion, which may just be that FIFA finds a clever way of getting around these loopholes. Or it may be that this crack in the dam gets pushed and pushed under more and more pressure until finally everything changes. I want to hear from you how you feel. Do you remember Lasana Diarra? I hope to see you again soon. And until I see you again, be lucky. Lots of love.
Subscribe.
And now that we're filming, go for it.
People, now subscribe.